The cold steel of a 9mm felt heavy in Han Taejun's hand as he ran a cloth over the slide, his eyes drifting to the reflection in the polished mahogany desk, specifically to the black ink of the snake tattoo scaling his neck. He stared at the mark not with pride, but with a cold, detached recognition of the monster he had become to earn it, a mark that signaled he belonged to the syndicate and nothing else. The silence of the room shattered when a small, warm hand touched the desk, and a whisper pierced his sterile world. "Daddy!" Tae-jaeun froze, the metallic click of the safety being engaged echoing like a heartbeat through the office as his gaze fell upon 5-year-old Layla. Behind her, Zara's breath hitched. Her hands trembled slightly against her gray uniform, but she didn't step back. With a subtle, desperate pressure, Zara's fingers dug into Layla's shoulders, a silent mother-daughter signal urging the child to retreat from the edge of the lion's desk, even as Zara's own eyes burned with a terrified courage. Before we uncover why a maid would risk her life to hide a mafia heir in the boss's own fortress, drop a comment with your location. Are you Team Zara or Team Tae-jaeun? Subscribe now, because this lockdown is about to turn deadly. Outside, the red emergency lights of the Emerald Dragon estate pulsed against the rain-streaked glass, signaling a total security breach and trapping the three of them in a 48-hour cage. Tae-jaeun looked from the innocent, fearless girl to the trembling woman who had served his tea in silence for 3 years, realizing his invisible Maid was the most dangerous variable in his empire. Zara watched his every move, her heart hammering against her ribs, yet she stood as a shield between the Iron Viper and the secret she had carried from Chicago. Every second in this office heightens the pressure, forcing a man who only believes in assets to reckon with a bloodline he never asked for. The walls are closing in, and the discovery they are about to make in the shadows of this estate will leave no one unscathed. Stick around, because the ending is inevitable. The silence following the word "Daddy" was more deafening than the sirens wailing outside the estate. Han Taejun didn't move, his eyes remaining fixed on the reflection of his own neck tattoo in the polished mahogany desk. The ink of the snake seemed to writhe as his pulse quickened. He finally looked up, his gaze cutting through the air like a blade toward Zara. She stood paralyzed, her fingers twitching against Layla's shoulders, subtly trying to pull the girl back into the safety of her shadow. The fear in her eyes was a raw, vibrating thing, yet she didn't look away. Tae-jaeun reached into his desk drawer, and for a heartbeat, Zara's breath hitched, expecting a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a sterile medical kit, the white plastic gleaming under the desk lamp. "I don't believe in coincidences, and I certainly don't believe in ghosts," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. He slid the kit across the desk toward them. 10 minutes. If the swab doesn't match, you both leave this house through the incinerator. The power in the room shifted instantly. Zara's shaking hands stilled as she looked at the kit, then back at the man she had served in silence for 3 years. The Iron Viper expected her to beg or plead her innocence, but the fear in her eyes was suddenly replaced by a cold, sharpened clarity. She didn't reach for the swab. Instead, she stepped forward, placing herself directly between Taejun's desk and her daughter, her posture losing its servant's slouch and regaining a military-grade stiffness. "You think a drop of blood is the only thing that connects you to this child, Taejun?" she asked, her voice steady enough to crack the glass of his whiskey bottle. She leaned in, her face inches from his, defying every protocol of the Emerald Dragon estate. "I didn't choose this house because I needed a job. I chose it because I knew exactly whose blood runs through her veins. I've watched you for 3 years. I know about the Chicago shipment. I know about the man you left in the alley 6 years ago." Tae-jaeun's hand, still resting near the 9mm, tightened until his knuckles turned white. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't the hunter in this house. He was the mark. Zara hadn't been hiding. She had been infiltrating. The maid he considered a non-entity had been cataloging his sins while raising his heir right under his roof. The emotional weight of the betrayal collided with the sudden, terrifying reality that if Zara knew his secrets, so did his enemies. Just as he opened his mouth to demand how she survived Chicago, The heavy, reinforced doors of the office groaned under a massive external impact. The lockdown wasn't just to keep people in. It was failing to keep the world out. Tae-Jaeun looked at the DNA kit, then at the woman who had just redefined his entire reality, realizing he had 10 minutes to decide if he was going to kill the only woman who truly knew him, or trust the woman who had spent years planning his downfall. The sirens outside shifted pitch, a warning that the first perimeter had been breached, leaving him with a choice that would either save his bloodline or bury it forever. The crimson strobes of the emergency lights painted the office in the color of fresh blood as the heavy mahogany desk vibrated from a secondary explosion elsewhere in the wing. The Emerald Dragon estate, designed to be an impenetrable vault, suddenly felt like a tomb. Han Tae-Jun didn't look at the monitors. He watched Zura, whose eyes were no longer those of submissive Maid, but of a cornered predator calculating the distance to the 9mm on his desk. The power dynamic in the room had inverted the moment the first breach occurred. Tae-Jaeun realized that he couldn't cast them out into the chaos, nor could he leave them in this room to be slaughtered. If Layla was indeed his blood, and the terrifying certainty in Zara's gaze suggested she was, then the child was the only piece of himself left in a world currently trying to erase him. He reached into the hidden compartment beneath his desk and pulled out a sleek, secondary sidearm, flicking the safety off with a practiced thumb. If you move toward the door, my men will shoot you. If you stay here, the rivals will find you. Tae-Jun's voice was a low growl, barely audible over the rising mechanical scream of the security sirens. He stood up, his tall frame casting a jagged shadow over the child, his hand twitching near the snake tattoo on his neck, as if the ink itself were sensing the coming hunt. The new information was a jagged pill. The breach wasn't a random hit. The tactical precision of the explosions indicated an inside job, a betrayal from within the Iron Viper syndicate itself. Zara sensed the shift in his energy, her breath hitching as she saw the monster realize he was being hunted in his own den. She stepped closer to Layla, her hand resting protectively on the girl's head, showing a courage that forced Tae-Jun to look at her not as a servant, but as a soldier. The emotional pressure intensified as Layla looked up at Tae-Jun, her wide eyes reflecting the flashing red lights, showing no fear, only a haunting, silent expectation that he would act like the man she believed him to be. This wasn't just a siege, it was a trial. The stakes escalated when the internal intercom crackled to life, and a distorted voice, one Tae-Jun recognized as his own second-in-command, informed him that the impure bloodline had been located. The betrayal was absolute. Tae-Jaeun looked at the woman who had infiltrated his life and the daughter he was starting to recognize, realizing he was now fighting a war on two fronts. He didn't offer a choice. He simply grabbed Zara's arm and shoved the spare weapon in her hand. The metal was cold, a grim promise of the violence required to survive the night. He had to decide now, trust the woman who had lied to him for years, or watch his legacy die on the office floor. The doors rattled under a fresh hail of gunfire, and the lock began to glow white-hot from a thermal charge. The thermal charge at the door hissed, a jagged line of molten light eating through the reinforced steel, but inside the office, the air had turned to ice. Han Tae-Jun ignored the encroaching killers, his focus narrowing entirely on the 5-year-old girl standing in the center of his crumbling sanctuary. He leaned down, his shadow swallowing her small frame, his face a mask of terrifying, calculated aggression. He wanted to see her break. He wanted the fear to prove she was just another pawn in Zara's long game. "Do you even know who I am?" he rasped, the snake tattoo on his neck tightening as he bared his teeth. He was the Iron Viper, a man who had burned his past to build a throne of glass, and he refused to be manipulated by a child's innocence. He loomed closer, expecting tears or a scream, but Layla didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into the collar of her gray dress and pulled out a tarnished silver locket, her tiny fingers steady as she snapped the casing open and held it up to his eyes. Tae-Jaeun's breath hitched, the predatory snarl dying in his throat as he stared at the miniature photograph inside. It wasn't a picture of a mafia boss. It was a government-issued ID from a lifetime ago. A younger, softer version of himself named Park Ji-hoon, a man who had existed before the blood, before the ink, and before the syndicate had renamed him. This was the identity he had spent a decade and millions of dollars trying to erase from every database on Earth. The power in the room shifted with a violent jolt. The intimidation was gone, replaced by a paralyzing vulnerability. He looked at Zara, who stood with the heavy handgun he had given her, her eyes fixed on the melting door. She hadn't just known his name. She held the original sin of his life. If this locket fell into the hands of the men currently burning through his door, his legitimacy within the Emerald Dragon would evaporate, and he would be executed as a fraud by his own counsel. The emotional conflict deepened as Layla touched the snake on his neck with her free hand, her wide eyes filled with a terrifyingly pure recognition. "Mommy said you had to wear the snake so the bad men wouldn't see Ji-hoon," she whispered. The revelation was a physical blow, cracking the armor he had worn for years. The stakes had escalated beyond a simple siege. This was now a race to suppress a truth that could destroy the entire syndicate. Tae-joon realized that Zara hadn't just been raising his daughter. She had been preserving his soul, keeping the man he used to be alive in the mind of a child. As the office door finally buckled inward with a thunderous crash, Tae-joon didn't reach for his gun to kill the witnesses. He stepped in front of them, shielding the locket and the girl with his own body. The first assassin stepped through the smoke, but Tae-joon wasn't looking at the enemy. He was looking at the small piece of silver that proved his whole life was a lie. The pressure was now a ticking clock. He had to kill everyone in the hallway before they saw what Layla was holding, or he would have to burn the estate to the ground with all of them inside. The heavy office doors finally gave way, but it wasn't the rival clan that stormed in first. It was Tae-joon's own elite security detail, led by a scarred captain named Sang-dae. They moved with mechanical precision, their barrels sweeping the room before settling on the black woman and the child. Sang-dae didn't look at the melting door or the encroaching sirens. His eyes were fixed on Layla and the silver locket she still clutched. "Sir, the perimeter is failing," Sang-dae barked, his voice devoid of empathy. "The child and the maid are liabilities. They are slowing our extraction. We need to remove the distractions now." The threat was thinly veiled. In the syndicate's language, removal meant a quiet execution to ensure the boss moved faster. Tae-joon felt the air in the room thicken. He was the man who had ordered 1,000 such removals, but as he looked at the girl who held his original identity in her palm, the logic of the snake tattoo on his neck felt like a noose. The power shift happened in a blur of motion that defied everything Tae-joon knew about his invisible maid. As Sang-dae reached out to grab Layla's arm, Zara didn't flinch or beg. She moved with a terrifying, coiled economy of force. In one fluid second, she stepped into Sang-dae's guard, her palm striking his chin while her other hand twisted the wrist holding his tactical rifle. A sickening crack echoed through the office, and before the other guards could even chamber around, Zara had Sang-dae's own weapon pressed against his throat, using the massive man as a human shield. Her eyes were no longer wide with domestic fear. They were cold, predatory, and filled with a seasoned military discipline. "I spent 4 years in a forward operating base in Iraq before I ever set foot in Chicago," Zara hissed, her voice a low, lethal vibration. "If any of you touches her again, I will paint this mahogany with your captain's brains." Tae-joon stared at the woman he had considered a non-entity for 3 years. A new and dangerous information set rewriting his reality. She wasn't just a mother protecting a child. She was a professional who had been hiding her lethality in plain sight, likely waiting for the exact moment the Iron Viper showed a weakness. The emotional conflict surged as he realized that Zara hadn't just been raising his heir. She had been guarding her with the skills of a soldier. The stakes reached a breaking point when Sang-dae, choking against the steel of his own rifle, managed to gasp out a betrayal. The orders to eliminate the girl hadn't come from a tactical necessity, but from the syndicate elders themselves. They already knew. The lockdown wasn't just to keep rivals out. It was a cage designed to prune the bloodline. Zara shoved the captain away, her gaze locking onto Tae-joon's. "You have to choose right now, Ji-hoon," she said, using the forbidden name from a locket. "Are you their Viper, or your father? Because the next person through that door isn't here for the throne." They're here for her. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway, and Tae-Jaeun realized the collision was no longer avoidable. The smoke from the thermal charge curled around the room like a ghost, and as Han Tae-Jun looked at Zara's lethal stance, the sterile office vanished, replaced by the neon-drenched grit of a rainy Chicago night 6 years ago. For years, he had filed that night away as a rare moment of weakness, a fleeting lapse in judgment before he ascended to the head of the Emerald Dragon. But staring at the mother of his child now, a jagged new truth tore through his memory. He hadn't just met a beautiful stranger in a high-end lounge. He had been lured there. He remembered the way the shadows had moved in the alleyway after they left, the silent flash of a blade he'd barely dodged, and the way Zara had disappeared into the darkness just as the first shot rang out. He had always assumed she was a casualty of the chaos, but looking at her now, holding Sangdae's tactical rifle with a veteran's ease, he realized the one night was a meticulously staged execution attempt by the very syndicate elders who now called for her head. The power shifted as Tae-Jun realized the depth of the deception. "You weren't just a guest that night," he rasped, his voice cutting through the distant sound of shattering glass. "You were the bait." The emotional conflict intensified as Zara's expression didn't soften. It hardened into a mask of bitter irony. "I was the trigger," she corrected, her grip tightening on the weapon. "But when I saw who you really were, before you let the snake swallow your soul, I jammed the mechanism. I saved your life in that alley, Tae-Jaeun, and I've been paying for that mercy ever since." This revelation redefined everything. He wasn't her protector, and she wasn't his victim. They were two survivors of a failed conspiracy, bound by a bloodline that was never meant to exist. The stakes escalated to a terminal point. The syndicate hadn't just discovered Layla. They were finishing the job they started in Chicago. Outside the office, the heavy thud of breaching rams echoed against the corridor walls. The elders weren't sending soldiers to assist him. They were sending a cleanup crew to erase the evidence of their 6-year-old failure. Tae-Jun looked at Layla, who was tucked firmly behind Zara's legs, her eyes still fixed on him with that terrifying, innocent hope. He was a man who lived by the code of the Viper, yet he found himself standing at the center of a lie that spanned 2 continents. The inevitable collision was no longer a threat. It was happening. If he opened those doors, he wasn't just defending his throne. He was declaring war on the very men who gave it to him. The internal intercom hissed one last time, a cold, final directive from the council: 0 survivors. Tae-Jaeun reached for his primary weapon, his gaze meeting Zara's in a silent, desperate pact. The pressure was a physical weight. Either he stepped into the line of fire for a ghost and a child, or he let the snake consume the last of his humanity. The wall of monitors in the office flickered to life, bathing the room in a clinical, blue light that clashed with the pulsing red of the lockdown. The faces of the 3 syndicate elders appeared, their features weathered and stone-cold, looking down at Han Tae-Jun like judges at a sentencing. In the background, the sound of his own men screaming in the hallways served as a grisly soundtrack. The elders didn't acknowledge the smoke or the debris. They only looked at the woman holding a rifle and the child clutching a silver locket. The central elder, a man whose family had founded the dragon lineage, spoke with a voice like grinding gravel. "The purity of the Viper's throne is not a suggestion, Tae-Jaeun. It is the law. A half-blood heir is not a legacy. It is a contamination of our financial and spiritual sovereignty." The new information was a cold blade. The elders weren't just here to kill a witness. They were here to revoke his life's work. The power shifted as Tae-Jun realized the depth of the bloodline debt. If he acknowledged Layla, he wouldn't just be a father in danger. He would be a traitor to the code that gave him his name. His rank, his billions, and his protection would vanish in an instant, leaving him as vulnerable as the maid he had looked down upon. The emotional conflict hit a fever pitch as he stood between the screen and the girl. He could see his own reflection in the dark monitors, the snake on his neck looking more like a parasite than a badge of honor. Zara watched him, her finger tightening on the trigger of the stolen tactical rifle. She wasn't waiting for him to save her. She was waiting to see if he would sell them out to keep his crown. The pressure was suffocating. The man who had traded his soul for a throne now had to decide if he was willing to burn that throne to the ground for a child he had known for less than an hour. The stakes reached a terminal velocity when the elder leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the screen. You have 60 seconds to prove your loyalty. Execution is the only currency we accept for forgiveness. Kill the maid and the girl, or we will authorize the total purge of the Emerald Dragon estate. The revelation was a death knell. A total purge meant a thermobaric leveling of the entire fortress, leaving no evidence and no survivors. The collision was no longer a possibility. It was a countdown. Tae-jaeun looked at Layla, who was staring at the screen with a fearless, quiet dignity that she could have only inherited from him. He felt the weight of the gun in his hand and the crushing gravity of his rank. As the timer on the screen began to tick down from 60, the sound of heavy boots reached the very threshold of the office. Tae-jaeun didn't raise his weapon towards Zura. He turned his back to the elders, cutting the video feed with a single, violent smash of his fist against the console. The silence that followed was the loudest sound in the world, a declaration of war that left them with nowhere to run and no one to trust. The darkness of the private elevator shaft offered a momentary reprieve from the strobes, but the silence was shattered by a rhythmic, metallic chirping emanating from the floor below. As the doors hissed open into the chilled air of the subterranean wine cellar, the total purge was no longer a theoretical threat. Nestled among vintage bottles worth more than most men earned in a lifetime was a thermobaric device, its digital display bleeding a malevolent red. Han Tae-jaeun stared at the complexity of the wiring, the snake on his neck feeling like a brand of death. He was a master of corporate warfare and street executions, but he was no technician. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The elders hadn't just authorized a hit. They had rigged his own sanctuary to become his funeral pyre. The stakes had moved from a localized siege to an imminent, explosive erasure. The power shifted with a sharp, command-style bar from Zara. Move. Now. She didn't wait for his permission. Dropping the tactical rifle, she knelt before the device, her fingers moving with a terrifyingly precise intent. Tae-jaeun watched, stunned, as she began to recite the proprietary encryption sequences of the Emerald Dragon's own security firmware. How do you know the overrides? He demanded, his hand hovering over his sidearm. The new information was a jagged revelation. Zara hadn't just been cleaning his floors. She had been a ghost in his machine. I spent 3 years studying the cadence of your keystrokes and the reflection of your monitors in the glass, she spat, not looking up from the blinking detonator. I knew the day would come when you'd be too blinded by your own shadow to see the trap closing. I'm not just the help, Tae-jaeun. I'm the only reason this house hasn't already turned to ash. The emotional conflict deepened as Layla stood by the cellar door, her small hand clutching the silver locket, her eyes reflecting the countdown. She wasn't looking at the bomb. She was looking at Tae-jaeun, waiting for him to do something more than just watch. The man who prided himself on absolute control was now entirely dependent on a woman he had treated as a ghost. As Zara bypassed the third layer of security, she hit a hard-coded lockout that required a biometric scan, Tae-jaeun's. The collision was here. To stop the countdown, he had to press his hand to a device that was tied directly to the syndicate's central hub, effectively signaling his location and his defiance to every hunter and soul. The pressure was a physical weight as the timer ticked into its final 60 seconds. If you touch that, there's no going back to being the Viper, Zara warned, her voice trembling for the first time. Tae-jaeun looked at the red light, then at the daughter who carried his old name, realizing that saving their lives meant finally killing the man he had become. He reached out his hand, but as his palm met the cold glass, the cellar doors behind them began to hiss open. The biometric scanner hissed as Tae-jaeun's palm met the glass, the red countdown freezing at a mere 4 seconds. But the victory was instantly hollowed by a soft, thudding sound behind him. Layla had collapsed against the cold stone floor of the cellar, her small frame shivering violently despite the humid heat of the underground bunker. Zara was at her side in a heartbeat, her hands pressing against the girl's forehead with a desperation that mirrored the flickering emergency lights. She's burning up, Zara gasped, her voice cracking for the first time since the siege began. The stress, Her heart can't take the adrenaline spikes. If we don't break this fever, she'll go into shock. The new information hit Tae-jaeun like a physical blow. His daughter didn't just have his eyes and his nerves. She had the congenital heart murmur he had kept a secret since his own childhood, a weakness he thought he had buried under layers of scar tissue and ink. The power shifted as the Iron Viper was suddenly stripped of his tactical advantage. He could fight off a dozen assassins, but he was powerless against a failing heart. The only medicine that could stabilize her was kept in his private medical suite 3 floors up, a path now crawling with the Syndicate's purge teams. "Stay here. Lock the vault from the inside," Tae-jaeun commanded, his voice a lethal rasp. He didn't wait for Zara's protest. He stepped out of the cellar, not as a boss commanding an army, but as a father hunting for a lifeline. The emotional conflict deepened as he realized that every step he took toward the medicine was a step away from his own safety. He was no longer the hunter. He was a man exposing his throat to save a piece of his soul. The stakes escalated as he moved through the darkened corridors, the snake on his neck itching with the sweat of a man who finally had something to lose. He reached the medical suite only to find the door wide open and the cabinets ransacked. The twist revealed itself in the shattered glass of the pharmacy. The medicine hadn't been lost in the chaos. It had been intentionally removed. His second-in-command knew about the heart condition. They weren't just trying to shoot him. They were waiting for the bloodline to fail on its own. Tae-jaeun's hand tightened on his sidearm as he heard the distinct click of a safety being disengaged behind a row of high-tech surgical monitors. The inevitable collision was no longer a hallway skirmish. It was an ambush designed for a man whose priorities had shifted. He had the empty vial in his hand, but the pressure was a suffocating weight as a voice emerged from the shadows. "You're late, Tae-jaeun. A father should always be on time." The second-in-command stepped into the light, holding the life-saving injector in one hand and a silenced pistol in the other. The blue glow of the surgical monitors cast a ghostly pall over Han Tae-jaeun's face as he stared into the cold eyes of Jin-ho, his second-in-command. The heavy silence of a medical suite was broken only by the rhythmic beep of a nearby life support machine, a sound that felt like a countdown to his daughter's death. Jin-ho stood casually, tossing the life-saving epinephrine injector into the air and catching it, his thumb grazing the trigger of a silenced pistol. The power shift was absolute. The man Tae-jaeun had mentored, the man who knew every shadow of the Emerald Dragon estate, was no longer a loyal lieutenant. He was the executioner. "You always said a leader shouldn't have a pulse, Tae-jaeun," Jin-ho remarked, his voice smooth and devoid of the chaos raging outside. "But yours has been racing ever since that little girl called you daddy." The new information was a jagged, poisonous revelation. Jin-ho hadn't just discovered Layla. He had been the one to leak her existence to the elders. He didn't just want the girl dead. He wanted the throne that her existence had tainted. The elders didn't find her, Tae-jaeun. "I showed her to them," Jin-ho admitted, his gaze hardening. "A boss with a weakness is a dead boss. You're already a ghost. You just haven't stopped breathing yet." The emotional conflict surged as Tae-jaeun realized the depth of the betrayal. This wasn't a sudden coup. It was a long-planned harvest. Jin-ho had been waiting for Tae-jaeun to show a human flicker, a moment of vulnerability to justify his replacement. By trying to save his daughter, Tae-jaeun had handed his rival the perfect weapon. The stakes escalated as the internal intercom buzzed, a direct line from the cellar where Zara and Layla were barricaded. Zara's voice was a frantic whisper, reporting that the secondary door seals were failing under a hydraulic ram. Tae-jaeun was trapped between 2 deaths. If he fought Jin-ho, the medicine might be destroyed in the struggle. If he surrendered, he would watch his legacy and his bloodline be extinguished simultaneously. Jin-ho's smile widened, sensing the paralysis. "I've already made the deal. The elders get a pure line of succession, and I get the estate. All I need is for the Iron Viper to die a hero's death defending a maid's mistake." The inevitable collision was no longer a distant threat. It was a choice between the man he was and the man he had become. Tae-jaeun lowered his own weapon, a move that stunned Jin-ho for a fraction of a second. The pressure in the room became a physical weight, thick with the scent of ozone and betrayal. "You want a throne, Jin-ho?" Then you have to take it from my cold, dead hands, Tae-Jaeun rasped, his eyes flashing with a predatory light that Jin-ho hadn't seen in years. But as Tae-Jaeun lunged, Jin-ho didn't aim for the boss. He aimed for the injector, his finger tightening on the trigger to shatter the only hope for Layla's survival. The surgical suite was a wreck of shattered glass and flickering monitors after Jin-ho's tactical retreat, but the adrenaline injector remained intact in Tae-Jaeun's trembling hand. He ignored the blood trickling from a graze on his temple, sprinting back toward the cellar as the estate's foundations groaned under a fresh artillery strike from the surface. When he finally breached the vault, he found Zara kneeling over Layla, the girl's breathing now a shallow, terrifying rattle. Tae-Jaeun slammed the injector into his daughter's thigh, watching her chest heave as the medicine took hold. The immediate crisis of the fever broke, but the atmospheric pressure in the room only intensified. Tae-Jaeun stood up, the snake on his neck slick with sweat, and pulled a water-damaged checkbook from his internal suit pocket. With a steady hand, he scrawled a figure that would buy a small country, $10 million, and thrust the paper toward Zara. The secondary extraction tunnel at the back of the cellar leads to the drainage system, Tae-Jaeun rasped, his voice sounding like glass on stone. Take the money. Take the girl. My offshore accounts are untraceable. If you leave now, you could be in Singapore by dawn while I hold this floor. The power shifted as he waited for the relief to wash over her, expecting the maid to seize the lifeline he was offering. Instead, Zara stood up, the tactical rifle still slung across her back, and looked at the check with a chilling, focused contempt. She didn't reach for the paper. She grabbed it and tore it into a dozen white fragments that fluttered to the damp floor like snow. You still think you can buy your way out of a bloodline, Tae-Jaeun? She asked, her voice a low, lethal vibration. $10 million won't stop the syndicate from hunting her to the ends of the earth once they know she's a viper. The new information was a cold, hard truth. Zara wasn't looking for a payout. She was looking for a fortress. She knew that without Tae-Jaeun's active protection and his seat at the table, Layla was a dead girl walking, regardless of the zeros in her bank account. The emotional conflict deepened as she stepped into his personal space, her hand gripping the lapel of his charcoal suit. I don't want your blood money. I want your name. I want you to walk out those doors and tell the world she is yours, or we all die in this cellar together. The stakes had moved beyond survival to a total, public reclamation of his past. The pressure reached a breaking point as the vault's external cameras flickered, showing the rival clan and the syndicate's purge teams merging into a single, massive force at the elevator bank. They were no longer fighting each other. They were joining forces to eliminate the common threat, the truth. Tae-Jaeun looked at the torn paper on the floor, realizing his wealth was worthless. The only currency left was his life. The heavy vault doors began to buckle under a high-yield thermal charge, and the heat in the room rose until the air was a suffocating weight. The thermal charge detonated with a bone-jarring roar, but the blast didn't come from the vault doors. It ripped through the library's ceiling above, showering the room in pulverized marble and shredded literature. The Emerald Dragon had been flayed open. Through the swirling dust and smoke, the combined force of rival assassins and the Syndicate's own purge teams descended on zip lines, their suppressed weapons spitting silent, lethal tongues of flame. Han Tae-Jaeun didn't reach for a tactical plan or a bargaining chip. As the first volley of lead chewed into the mahogany desk where the nightmare began, he threw his pride to the floor. For the first time in his life, the man known as the Iron Viper didn't move to attack. He lunged across the debris, his charcoal suit jacket snapping open like a dark wing, and threw his entire frame over Layla. The sound of bullets thudding into the heavy leather of his chair and the meat of his shoulder was a sickening, rhythmic percussion. Tae-Jaeun grunted, his teeth bared, the snake tattoo on his neck straining against his tensed muscles as he curled his body into a human shield. Beneath him, Layla was a small, trembling warmth, her tiny hands clutching the silver locket against his chest. The power shift was instantaneous and visceral. The predator had become the prey, and the most feared man in Seoul was now nothing more than a barrier of flesh and bone. New information surfaced in the chaos. The assassins weren't firing indiscriminately. They were using specialized, non-lethal rounds for Zara, but live ammunition for Tae-Jaeun and the child. They wanted the woman alive for questioning, to find out who else knew about the Chicago failure. But the bloodline was to be erased on sight. The emotional conflict surged through the pain as Tae-Jaeun felt Layla's heartbeat against his own ribs, a frantic, synchronized rhythm that blurred the line between his survival and hers. Zara didn't waste the second he bought her. She rose from the shadows of a fallen bookshelf, her tactical rifle barking in short, controlled bursts that dropped two zip-lining assassins before they hit the floor. Her face was a mask of cold, professional rage, but her eyes flickered with a raw, agonizing hope as she saw the man she hated protecting the child she loved. The stakes reached a terminal peak as the library's secondary gas lines hissed, severed by the gunfire. The air became a shimmering haze of volatile fuel. The inevitable collision was no longer about the throne. It was about the next 10 seconds. Tae-Jaeun looked up, his vision blurring as blood soaked through his tailored sleeve, and saw Sang-dae standing on the mezzanine, a flare gun aimed directly at the pooling gas. The pressure was a suffocating, physical weight. If Tae-Jaeun moved to save himself, the girl died. If he stayed, they all burned. He locked eyes with Zara, a silent, bloody command passing between them. He wasn't just shielding his daughter. He was prepared to be the fuel for their escape. Sang-dae's finger tightened on the trigger, and the library turned into a pressurized tinderbox waiting for the single spark that would redefine their existence. The library ignited in a flash of orange heat as the gas line caught, but Zara had already triggered the emergency fire shutters, slamming a wall of reinforced steel between them and the explosion. In the sudden, flickering dimness of the sub-corridor, Han Tae-Jaeun slumped against the cold concrete, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. The charcoal wool of his suit was now a deep, sodden black where the rounds had pierced his shoulder and side. He looked down at his trembling hands, the geometric crest tattoo on his knuckles stained with his own crimson. The Iron Viper, the man who had ordered deaths with a casual flick of his wrist, was finally bleeding out in the dark. The power shift was absolute. His empire was a burning pyre above them, and his physical strength was draining into the floor. But as the world began to tilt, a small, steady hand slipped into his. Layla didn't scream. She didn't cry. While Zara frantically tore strips of her gray maid's uniform to create a makeshift tourniquet, the 5-year-old sat perfectly still, her wide eyes locked onto Tae-Jaeun's fading gaze. She wasn't just brave, she was eerily composed. In the terrifying silence of the tunnel, Tae-Jaeun saw the new, chilling truth. Layla wasn't reacting like a child, she was reacting like him. She possessed the same legendary cold nerves that had allowed him to survive the cutthroat politics of the Seoul underworld for a decade. The realization was a jagged twist. She wasn't just his daughter by blood. She was his spiritual heir, a predator in the making. The emotional conflict deepened into a dark, protective possessiveness. He wasn't just saving a victim. He was preserving a legacy that was sharper and more dangerous than any syndicate elder could imagine. The bleeding won't stop without surgical intervention, Zara hissed, her hands slick with red as she tightened the cloth around his arm. Her military precision was fraying, replaced by the sheer terror of a mother watching the only wall between her daughter and a firing squad crumble. Tae-Jaeun reached up, his bloody fingers gripping Zara's wrist with a strength that defied his wounds. The stakes escalated to a terminal vow. "If I don't make it to the docks," he rasped, the snake on his neck tightening as he forced the words out, "you don't run. You go to the secondary vault in Incheon. The code is her birth date. Inside is the kill switch for the syndicate's entire offshore network." This was the blood oath, a total surrender of his leverage to the woman he once treated as a shadow. He was handing her the nuclear option of the financial world. Zara stared at him, the weight of the secret shifting the air between them. They were no longer Maid and master, but co-conspirators in a global heist. The pressure intensified as a heavy, rhythmic thudding began to vibrate through the tunnel walls. The total purge, teams were using ground-penetrating sonar. They were directly above. Tae-Jaeun pulled Layla closer, his cold nerves matching hers as he felt the vibration of the hunter's boots through the floor. They were trapped in a narrowing throat of concrete, and the next door they opened would either lead to the sea or a mass grave. The sonar thudding from above ceased, replaced by the screech of a high-speed industrial saw cutting through the ceiling of the drainage tunnel. As the concrete slab fell, a team of specialized commandos in black tactical gear dropped into the muck, but they didn't raise their weapons toward Han Tae-jun. Instead, their leader, a man from the rival Oh-sung clan, lowered his visor and stared directly at Zara, his voice amplified by a grim, distorted speaker. "Princess Elena," he shouted, the name echoing like a death knell through the narrow vault. "The Oh-sung does not forget its own. Step away from the Viper and bring the child home." Tae-jun, slumped against the damp wall, felt a chill more piercing than his bullet wounds. He looked at the woman he knew as Zara, the invisible maid he had vetted a dozen times, and saw her mask finally dissolve. She wasn't just an American expat or a soldier from Chicago. She was the sole survivor of the Oh-sung massacre he had led 7 years ago, the daughter of the rival chairman he believed he had executed with his own hands. The power shift was violent and absolute. The information rewritten every interaction they had shared for 3 years. Zara, Elena, hadn't just been hiding from a dark past. She had been a Trojan horse inside the Emerald Dragon, waiting for the exact moment the Viper was at his weakest to reclaim her father's legacy. Tae-jun's hand went for his gun, but his fingers were too slick with blood to grip the textured handle. "You didn't kill him," she whispered, her voice devoid of its domestic softness, replaced by the steel of a royal exile. "You killed my brothers. You killed my name. But you left me alive in that burning house, Tae-jun. I spent 3 years scrubbing your floors just to see the look on your face when you realized who was raising your heir." The emotional conflict was a jagged blade. He had fallen in love with a ghost who had been sharpening a knife for his throat every night. The stakes escalated as the Oh-sung commandos fanned out, their lasers dotting Tae-jun's chest while avoiding Layla. The commandos weren't here to rescue a maid. They were here to retrieve a princess and the child who now held the keys to both the dragon and the Oh-sung fortunes. Tae-jun looked at Layla, who remained eerily calm, her hands still locked in his, her cold nerves finally explained by the warring bloodlines surging through her veins. She was the fusion of 2 empires that had spent decades trying to destroy each other. The pressure became unbearable as the Oh-sung leader stepped forward, extending a hand to Elena. "Kill him now, princess, and we take the child. The dragon falls tonight." Elena took a slow, deliberate step toward the commandos, her rifle aimed at Tae-jun's head. The collision was no longer a battle against the syndicate. It was a civil war within his own heart. He looked into her eyes, searching for the maid, but finding only the queen of a rival throne. She eased the trigger back, and the sound of the commandos' safeties clicking off filled the tunnel. The industrial saw finished its work, and the concrete slab crashed into the muck of the tunnel. But the sound was eclipsed by the ringing in Han Tae-jun's ears. He stared at the woman he had known as Zara, now revealed as Elena, the daughter of the rival Oh-sung chairman, and felt the foundations of his world dissolve. The Oh-sung commandos stood ready, their lasers dancing across his blood-soaked charcoal suit, but a new sound hissed from the comm unit on his shoulder. It was the syndicate elders, their voices distorted by the dampness of the tunnel. Tae-jun, the lead elder, hissed. "We know who she is. Kill the Oh-sung princess now, and your betrayal in Chicago will be forgiven. Protect her, and the purge teams will level this city block until not even your DNA remains." The power shift was absolute. His survival was no longer a matter of tactical skill, but a brutal binary choice dictated by the men who owned his soul. He looked at Elena, who stood with the stolen tactical rifle aimed squarely at his heart. The new information was a poison in his veins. He hadn't just been outmaneuvered. He had been dismantled by the very woman who had spent 3 years witnessing his every lonely moment. The emotional conflict surged with a violent, unwanted warmth. Despite the rifle, despite the betrayal, he realized he had fallen for the ghost who had been sharpening a knife for his throat. He saw the way she stood, the defiant tilt of her chin, and the way she had protected Layla's innocent heart. It was the only real thing in a life built on shadows. The stakes reached a terminal height when Layla stepped between them, her small hand reaching for the snake tattoo on his neck, her wide eyes begging for the violence to stop. "If you do this," Taejun rasped, his voice thick with the copper taste of blood, "the syndicate will never stop. They won't just kill you, Elena. They will turn her into what I am." He wasn't just begging for his life. He was warning her of the machine he had helped build. The power shifted again as Elena's finger trembled on the trigger. She wasn't just a princess seeking revenge. She was a mother realizing that killing the father of her child would complete the cycle of blood that destroyed her own family. The pressure became a physical weight as the Osong leader grew impatient, his finger tightening on his own weapon. "Princess, the Viper is a corpse. Execute him, or we will." Tae-Jaeun looked into Elena's eyes and saw the flicker of the maid he had once trusted. He didn't raise his gun to kill her. He lowered it, offering his chest to the laser sights. It was the final, inevitable collision of his two lives. He was choosing to die as a man rather than live as a snake. But as he waited for the impact, the tunnel echoed with the sound of a distant, massive vibration. The total purge wasn't waiting for his answer. The elders had triggered the thermobaric leveling of the estate. The floor beneath them buckled, and a wall of pressurized flame roared toward the tunnel entrance. Taejun grabbed Elena's hand, the choice no longer about life or death, but about who they would be in the seconds before they turned to ash. The roar of the thermobaric blast above sent a shockwave through the drainage tunnel that nearly threw Han Taejun off his feet, the sound of his burning empire a muffled thunder through tons of concrete. He didn't let go of Elena's hand. The power shift was raw and desperate. The Mafia Boss and the vengeful princess were now just two parents fleeing a furnace with a child between them. Elena's Osong commandos had been vaporized in the initial collapse of the mezzanine, leaving only the three of them to navigate the labyrinthine dark. Tae-Jaeun's breath was a wet rattle, his charcoal suit shredded and soaked with a mixture of sewage and blood, but he forced his legs to move. The secondary extraction point is 500 meters ahead. He wheezed, his internal map of the Emerald Dragon estate the only thing keeping them from being entombed. The emotional conflict was a physical ache. He was saving the woman who had lived a lie to destroy him, yet he had never felt more tied to her. They reached the final bulkhead door, the one meant to lead directly to the submerged escape submersibles. Tae-Jaeun punched the override code into the terminal, but instead of the hiss of hydraulics, the screen flashed a mocking, static yellow. New information flickered across the display. Manual lockout authorized by command. Tae-Jaeun's heart sank. This wasn't the Syndicate Elders doing. The encryption key on the screen was one he had personally designed for his second-in-command, Jin-Ho. The betrayal had a second, deeper layer. As the door groaned open under a manual crank, they didn't find a path to freedom. They found this shocking find that redefined the stakes. The entire escape tunnel was lined with industrial-grade C4, the timers synchronized to the estate's main collapse. His own men hadn't just betrayed him to the elders. They had turned his only exit into a kill box to ensure the Iron Viper and his impure bloodline never reached the surface. The stakes escalated to a terminal point as the smell of C4 and salt water filled the air. They were standing in the middle of a giant detonator. Elena looked at the wires, her face pale in the dim emergency light, her tactical rifle lowered. "They never meant for you to have a choice, Tae-Jaeun," she whispered. They rigged the exit before the siege even started. The pressure became a suffocating weight as the water level in the tunnel began to rise, pushed in by the incoming tide. If they stayed, they drowned. If they moved forward, they triggered the sensors. Tae-Jaeun looked at Layla, who was holding her silver locket so tightly her knuckles were white. The inevitable collision was no longer with an army, but with the cold reality of his own architecture of death. He realized that the only way to bypass the sensors was to stay at the terminal and hold the manual override while the others ran. A suicide mission. As the timer on the C4 chirped, signifying only 3 minutes remained, Taejun turned to Elena, his eyes reflecting a man who had finally found something worth more than his throne. The gunshot that should have ended the bloodline never came. Instead, the pier erupted as the kill switch Taejun had hidden in the Incheon vault finally synchronized, freezing every syndicate bank account and blacking out the harbor's power grid. In the sudden, absolute darkness, the sound of Jin-ho's pistol clicking on a jam chamber was the only evidence of his failure. Tae-jaeun didn't wait for a second chance. He lunged through the shadows, not with a blade, but with the raw, desperate strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. He tackled Zara and Layla into the freezing harbor waters just as the Osung snipers, blinded by the blackout, opened fire on the muzzle flashes of Jin-ho's men. The power shift was final. The Iron Viper had died in the flames of the estate, leaving only a man named Jaehoon to disappear into the black depths of the sea. 6 months later, the humid air of a small coastal village in Brazil carried the scent of salt and roasting coffee, a world away from the sterile neon of Seoul. Han Taejun, now Jaehoon, sat on a weathered wooden porch, the tropical sun beating down on the jagged, silver scar on his neck where the snake had once coiled. The transformation was absolute. The tailored charcoal suits were replaced by a simple linen shirt, and the cold, calculating stare of a killer had been softened by a weary, hard-earned peace. Beside him stood Zara, no longer a maid in a gray uniform, but his wife, her hand resting firmly on his shoulder as they watched the horizon. He was no longer a boss, his billions frozen or donated to anonymous charities to keep the hunters at bay. He was a ghost, a non-entity, and for the first time in his life, he was free. The emotional arc reached its zenith as Layla ran toward them, her laughter ringing out across the sand. She climbed into his lap, and as he wrapped his arm around her, he realized he had finally found his soul. The new information was a silent, shared understanding. They were still being watched by the ghosts of their past, but the syndicate was broken, and the Osung name was buried. They lived as they had fought, as equals and as partners. The stakes shifted one last time as a black sedan with tinted windows crawled slowly down the dusty road toward their home. Ji-hoon didn't reach for a gun. He reached for Zara's hand. The car didn't stop to release an assassin. Instead, a young courier stepped out, leaving a single, unmarked envelope at the gate before driving away. Inside was no threat, but a photograph of the Emerald Dragon estate, now nothing but a field of wildflowers. The cycle was over. Ji-hoon was no longer the Viper, and Zara was no longer the Shadow. As the sun set over their quiet sanctuary, he realized that the greatest heist he ever pulled wasn't for power. It was for the family he never thought he deserved. What do you think was the exact moment Tae-jaeun stopped being a mafia boss and started being a father? Was it the DNA test, or when he used his body as a shield? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.